When I think back to 2017, the memory I'm left with from Chelsea's season is Batshuayi celebrating at the Hawthorns, Conte rushing down the touchline, and Chelsea looking like a picture of health. They've been so mechanically good that season, and they looked to be heading into the summer from such a position of strength. Where did it start to go wrong?
Well, that was the summer when it started to unravel. Weirdly, my memory is more of Diego Costa threatening to let off a fire extinguisher in a press huddle at the Hawthorns post-match when he wanted to get on with the celebrations. But in some ways, actually, that's part of it, because he was such a volatile character. Even Antonio Conte struggled to deal with him over that summer. That was the summer of the infamous text message, which Costa implied was the manager forcing him out of the club. It's also the summer where Conte, in preparation for a return to the Champions League, bear in mind that Chelsea had won the league having not been in Europe, he realised they needed greater strength in depth. They needed to spend a lot of money that summer to be competitive at that level, and he wasn't the type of manager that was going to put up with a mediocre season in Champions League football. And he'd want to retain his title as well. So that was the summer where he goes to the board and sort of asks them politely, probably not so politely, to sign Romelu Lukaku from Everton and to sign Virgil van Dijk. And both of those players ultimately don't arrive. And the story goes that Conte, whilst on holiday that summer, is sort of receiving text messages and pinging off text messages to Marina Granovskaya and the recruitment department asking, what's happening? Are these players coming in? I want these players in, etc. And he's not getting the answers that he wants back. He's not getting the positives. Yeah, we're spending £150 million on two proper pedigree signings. And what they end up doing that summer is actually just papering over a load of cracks just to flesh out their squad, and you get a rush of players who haven't really generally worked out. You Danny Drinkwaters, David Zappacosta cost over £20 million. Ross Barkley eventually comes in January, but they did try and bring him in with a knee injury over that summer. So there's a bloated squad. Bakayoko is another one who comes in, who did arrive with a bit of pedigree from Monaco because he'd done so well in the Champions League the previous year. But it's a bloated squad. It's not necessarily a squad that's going to compete on two fronts to, Premier League and Champions League. And I think that's probably where the relationship between Conte and Granovskaya and the board starts to deteriorate quite markedly. And as soon as results turn over the course of the following subsequent season, the writing's basically on the wall for Conte. He's not the type of manager that will sit back and put up with what he perceives to be mediocrity. And I think he did think that the transfer business done was mediocre. And of course, Chelsea don't put up with managers being that political. So it was always going to go one way.
He seemingly wasn't afraid to let people know that he was dissatisfied either, because I remember there was a marked difference between his press conference demeanour in year one, which was 2016-17, when a lot of people bought into his charisma. He's an engaging person, even though Antonio Conte's English was a little bit pigeon to start with, and it was a little bit broken. He's a very enrapturing guy, and someone that certainly has an aura around him. Year two, there was that, it wasn't indifference, wasn't sort of flippancy, but clearly a very different vibe from him. When did Chelsea make the decision that they were definitively going to move on from him? Or was that something that was driven by him in the first instance?
I can't pinpoint the exact moment, but if you look at the results in the beginning of the year in 2018, the game at Watford in particular stands out. I think they got hammered 4-1 possibly. Bakayoko sent off very early on. And at that stage, it just felt like a fait accompli. I mean, that was him done. A few of us, sort of veterans, Chelsea veterans, had seen this happen before, not least with Italian managers, actually. I mean, in a very different style, but Carlo Ancelotti, really from maybe December of his second season, certainly in January, when he was enduring this difficult moment where Chelsea just couldn't get a result, however well they played. He was a dead man walking for the last 4 or 5 months of that season. And it felt the same with Conte, but for very political reasons. That you're right, his demeanour did change in the press conferences. He had a lot more edge to him, and those eyes were smouldering throughout that season. And he wasn't afraid to put the boot in publicly, which again rubs Chelsea up the wrong way. And he was almost challenging the board to get rid of him, whilst probably being quite clever and shrewd about how he was delivering it, because I think it would have, that he left them open to legal action if they had sort of swung the axe earlier.
Let's pick up on that legal action bit, because obviously when he leaves, the club enter into this long fractious period with his payoff, in relation to his payoff. Two questions there really. Like, the first is, why was that so complicated and protracted? And also, how much organisational energy did it sap? Because it seemed like at the time, for a period of months, you couldn't have a conversation about Chelsea's hierarchy without it getting mentioned as a subplot within in relation to whatever else they were trying to do, team building, anything else.
You look at the ultimate cost. £26.6 million is what they paid to get rid of Antonio Conte and his staff. It was an astonishing amount of money that eclipsed the amount they paid to Mourinho first time around, which I think was around £18 million. And at the time, we all balked at that. It was a staggering fee. There were two, as far as I understand, there were two sort of legal channels which he was pursuing. One for unfair dismissal, and one basically to get the last year of his contract paid up. Chelsea had this, they sort of learned from the Di Matteo fiasco where when Di Matteo was sacked later in the year after he'd won the Champions League with Chelsea in 2012, at the start of the next season he gets sacked, and he sat out the year before getting the Schalke job, and Chelsea effectively paid him on gardening leave until his contract expired, which it hurt them, it stung them. I mean, that's a big financial outlay. So they wanted to avoid that. So basically, if Conte had got another job immediately after leaving Chelsea, then Chelsea's severance package would have stopped at that point. But he just sat it out. He sat out the entire year and then joined Inter as soon as the last payment of his original Chelsea contract was made. So it hurt Chelsea financially, and even a club like Chelsea that we think of having, bottomless pockets and Abramovich's vast funding behind, they can't afford things like that. That is a football cost that goes down in FFP and stuff like that, and they need to avoid situations like that happening in the future. And I think it probably did shape how they appointed managers in the subsequent years.
In 2018, and probably for about a year, 18 months beforehand, Maurizio Sarri has risen to become the apple of the continent's eye. He's the high priest of technical football. And this is who Chelsea alight onto. Like, this is who they see as Antonio Conte's natural successor. But why is that? Because they've just had this incredibly volatile period in their history. It's costing them an absolute fortune, or it's about to cost them an absolute fortune. And Sarri, for all his virtues, is unproven in the Chelsea sense. He's never won anything at that point. And he's also someone who has been a little bit volatile in the past. How did that decision get made?
Looking back, I have no idea. And with the benefit of hindsight, it's a staggering decision. It feels like they've gone with the fella that was a la mode at the time, and he's the bloke who's just done so well and dazzled at Napoli, in the hope that they're appointing the equivalent of Benitez from his time at Valencia. Sarri is an idealist almost in the way he gets his football teams to play, but it's the style of play that is paramount, not whether they go and win things necessarily. And he probably would object to that, but that is the reality of how his career had panned out. And on the one hand, that would have appealed to Abramovich and Granovskaya, because Abramovich has always craved watching a sort of Guardiola-style pizzazz to his team, playing with a bit of panache. And he's not always had that. They've had success, but they've not always had that sort of swashbuckling style to them. Maybe a bit under Ancelotti, you could argue, certainly in the first season. So if he's pursuing that, then there's a logic to going with Sarri. But But Sarri's never been successful to the level that Chelsea expects their managers to be successful. So it was a massive, massive risk. And ultimately, it was a risk that didn't pay off. The fit was wrong, really from the outset. I mean, really from the outset.
One of the things that confused me at the time, and probably still does now, is that when you bring someone like that in, you have to nourish their ideas with recruitment and you have to facilitate their strategy. You mentioned Benitez and Valencia, and obviously when he came to Liverpool, there was a certain element of that in Liverpool's recruitment. Their recruiting bent around him in a way, not overly, but there were Spanish club players coming into the club. There were players who were suited to playing his style of football. With Sarri, I don't know. I mean, Jorginho comes in and would ultimately become a stick with which he was beaten for pretty much the duration of his time in the club. But did Chelsea become any more aware at that time of needing to bend around their manager? Because obviously a lot of these themes are holdovers from Conte's time. You know, one of the great issues there, as you've told us, is that the recruitment didn't live up to what he wanted. It didn't suit where he was trying to take the club. So did anything change during that period, or was Sarri not a victim, but was his reign afflicted by that same issue?
It's almost as if they sort of fobbed him off by giving him Jorginho.
Like a peace offering.
Yeah, he came in with him. I mean, he was part of the deal that actually brought him over, effectively.
You know what it reminds me of? It's like a young boy being packed off to boarding school, but being allowed to take a soft toy with him. You know, it's like a comfort blanket.
Well, Jorginho's been called worse. So, I mean, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think anything else did change. I think the club was set in its ways in terms of recruitment. It was still sort of operating a one-in, one-out policy, really, for the biggest signings. It wasn't in a position where it could go and repeat the lavish spending of Abramovich's first few years at the club. So it was unrealistic what Chelsea were asking of Sarri, and we should acknowledge that when we look at how it all sort of didn't unravel, but it just never really took off properly under Sarri, because it is impossible for him to have really implemented what he wanted to do when he just didn't have the personnel to do it. Jorginho, okay, he was key to everything that happened at Napoli, but you can't just have one player and do that, and the other players weren't suited. It's
also like it was a kind of a secrets out moment in the Premier League, where I think it was the game at Wembley where I think Pochettino stuck Dele Alli on him.
Yeah.
And hassled him, and all of Chelsea's rhythm sort of vanished from that game, and they got absolutely battered. I remember covering the game at Cardiff, which was a couple of months into it. There was already an atmosphere around him, and it was actually uncomfortable to be there. Chelsea ended up winning. I think Cesar Azpilicueta scored a hilariously offside goal at the end, which nearly killed Neil Warnock. But very clearly that was the point of no return, because the fans already decided that this wasn't going to work, and it was as hostile as I've seen an away set of fans towards their own manager around that time.
And that was hostile. I was there as well, and it was grim for Sarri. But I think actually worse was the atmosphere within Stamford Bridge. I think it was a Manchester United FA Cup tie that Chelsea lost, and that was the sort of first chorus of "fuck Sarri-ball" that coming up from the Matthew Harding, taken on by the Shed. Chelsea supporters had voiced their disapproval at Benitez's appointment as an interim manager back in sort of late 2012, and the last 5-6 months of that season was edgy. There were moments where, particularly in the first few games, I think they played City and Fulham very early on, and the fans made very clear their disgust that this man had been appointed at their club, a legacy of his time at Liverpool. It was worse with Sarri within the ground, because this was a team that on the face of it weren't actually doing that badly. I mean, they were always up near the top of the division, or relatively, certainly near the Champions League places.
Certainly, if you compare it to some of the disaster seasons in their past, like the kind of the Mourinho third season situation, like it was nothing like that. It just was. It was stale and unconvincing, but they were still winning enough games to be credible as a side in the division.
Maybe they've been sold the philosophy, this is going to be amazing, you're going to see the type of football we saw at Napoli last season, and the reality was it was just too slow paced for the Premier League. It didn't open teams up enough for Chelsea to run riot effectively. It was just, the whole thing was stodgy. It was the whole fit was wrong. Sarri didn't look as if he wanted to be there. It became very clear that the fans didn't want him to be there. I think some of the players backed him, but then, the subplots, his reluctance to use Loftus-Cheek and Hudson-Odoi for a lot of that season. Ironically, they come in towards the end of the season and do brilliantly, and actually probably enjoy their longest spell in the team at Chelsea that they've ever had as a pair. I mean, Loftus-Cheek over the course of that run-in was sensational. He was a better player for Chelsea than Eden Hazard, arguably. And then they both suffer their respective Achilles injuries, and that's their little Chelsea purple patch over. But everything was building towards the summer. And again, we knew another Italian manager in place who we knew wasn't going to be there the following season. And you throw in things like the FIFA transfer ban, which suddenly you've had a manager that's been acknowledging all season that for him to play the football that he wants to play, he needs new players in. And suddenly Chelsea aren't able to bring in new players for the next 2 transfer windows. And you realise that this is never going to work. It's not going to work. He's not going to be able to reinvent this team and get these players to play the way that he wants them to play. So we're never going to see Sarri-ball at Stamford Bridge.
They've got these players emerging. So Loftus-Cheek, you've mentioned. Hudson-Odoi, you've mentioned. Is this part of the reason why Frank Lampard appears as a blip on their radar? Like, beyond the obvious, Frank Lampard exists in Chelsea's atmosphere and will do forever, naturally. But around that time, his Derby County are good. They're fine. They have this big blip in the middle of the season, this big sort of collapse in their form, and they recover eventually to lose a playoff final. There's nothing in his management of Derby at that point which suggests that he's anything other than potentially, sometime in the future, maybe quite a capable manager. How does it happen that their interest becomes more than just the guy that used to play in our midfield to this is someone that we can entrust with what is ultimately a golden generation of future players?
I think there are a few factors. The transfer ban is probably principal amongst them. This is a club that realises that it's not going to be able to spend any money, significant money, in the next 2 windows. Okay, Pulisic is already pre-signed. Kovacic has an agreement; they can make that deal permanent. So they're also the only club that's ever had a transfer ban and managed to spend £100 million effectively. But that said, it wasn't the time to instigate a revolution, to have another coach come in like Sarri, who's going to want to play a particular way, that's going to require a particular type of player, who's going to have to come in from the outside because we don't have them on site. Chelsea's academy has been producing brilliant players for a long time. It's been winning FA Cup, Youth Cups every year for a generation, it feels like. I mean, they are the elite of the elite, and they have a generation whom Lampard knows well because he's had Mason Mount and Fikayo Tomori with him at Derby. He's come up against Tammy Abraham at Villa that season. He's come up against Reece James at Wigan that season. So players that he's familiar with. He's got the ex-under-18s coach as his assistant at Derby in Jody Morris. So if Chelsea are going to lean upon those players, even if it's just to bulk up the squad, but I think most people recognise that there's so much talent in a Mount, in a James, in an Abraham, that they're probably going to play a role in the first team. Then who better is there to oversee that development and that in the first team than a man who's already familiar with them all and knows how the club works, knows about the academy, has been there and watched this academy spring up from nowhere really, and just establish itself at the top level. That was one of the main appeals, I think, to Lampard. This is also a club that needs healing. You've got Marina Granovskaya reporting to Roman Abramovich in absentia after the whole visa furore, and saying, look, we've got a fan base that's in open revolt here against the manager. We've got schisms opening up everywhere. It's not a happy place. Okay, we've won the Europa League. We're in the Champions League next season. It's quite an appealing job in terms of the level of football you're going to be playing, but you're also not going to be able to spend money, which probably, when you're looking for a replacement for Maurizio Sarri, rules out most elite coaches in Europe. So we might be in exceptional circumstances here, it might be the time to bring someone in who will unite the fan base, who will heal all those rifts overnight, galvanise everybody. There'll be positivity in abundance. You know, a club icon, the leading scorer in the club's history, walks in the door, and he's served a bit of an apprenticeship at Derby. He's had a year. Okay, he hasn't gotten promoted, but he's done as well as any Derby manager in recent times has done. And he's obviously done it with quite a young setup as well, and not least with a couple of Chelsea players thrown in. So that is why it fits. That's why it works. Go back 5 years, there was absolutely no chance that Chelsea would have appointed a manager, whether homegrown or not, or a club icon or not, who'd only had a year's experience under his belt in the Championship, never competed at Champions League level, let alone Premier League level. But now actually it feels right, because this club needs to mend, and he's the man to do that.
I always felt it was actually a little bit of a clever sleight of hand from Chelsea, because you've got this nucleus of young players. Now, under normal circumstances, you know what the Premier League's like. You can't lose 3 games if you're a club like Chelsea. And if you come into a club and your first game sees you lose at Old Trafford like that, and your team is stocked full of developing players, I think if you're anyone other than Frank Lampard, you get an absolute pasting, and that's almost a point of no return from the very beginning. So it felt to me, and I don't know if this was ever part of Chelsea's thinking, like it enables, at the very least, it enables the club to see what they've got. They've always been beaten around about what they're able to graduate from their academy. And they've always had this thing about, because there's this sort of instant gratification culture at the club and this need to win now, that managers have never really had the opportunity to say, right, this midfield's yours, Mason Mount. This forward line is yours to pivot, Tammy Abraham, Reece James. You're not just going to come in for a game and a half and then get binned as soon as you make a mistake. We're going to put you in the side, and you can make mistakes, and I'm still going to pick you next week. Was that ever part of the thinking, or is that just a happy consequence of the appointment?
No, it definitely bought them time. It bought everybody time appointing him. But it goes back to the transfer embargo and the fact that these are exceptional circumstances. The other element, of course, is we haven't mentioned, is Eden Hazard's leaving. So that their best player for the last 7 years has gone to Real Madrid as well and can't be replaced directly. So, yeah, this is a means of buying time. And you can look at that defeat at Manchester United. I actually think that was weirdly one of their better performances.
They were very good for half an hour in that
game. They did okay and ended up losing 4-0. But c'est la vie. But he has that. He basically he can do no wrong for a while. We know that he's not untouchable, but because of the circumstances around the club at the time, and because everybody realises that these are really difficult, and actually finishing 4th might actually be a bit of an achievement. Chelsea, again, in exceptional circumstances. You go back throughout Abramovich's time, that's never been the case before. Look at all the managers that have lost their jobs as soon as Champions League qualification is threatened. High caliber managers, Luis Felipe Scolari and Ancelotti, and even Conte to a certain extent, all these guys, and a European Cup winning manager in Di Matteo who won it a few months before, he gets binned off because it looks as if Chelsea might not finish in the top 4. Well, Lampard comes in and it's almost like, yeah, you finish in the top 4, that's brilliant, thank you. Whereas every other manager that's ever been appointed by Abramovich is, finishing the top 4, that's the bare minimum, and then we'd like you to be competing for the Premier League title as well, if not Europe. So it was just exceptional circumstances, and they were very fortunate that Lampard had even had a year's management under his belt in many ways, because that allowed them to go and pursue him to take over.
Okay, so these were exceptional circumstances, and to a certain extent, football is still feeling the effects of the pandemic and will do for some time. But Chelsea have almost reverted to something like their norm of maybe about a decade ago. They spent over £200 million across the summer, and that, just because of their past, that sets off organ music, because that changes the context in which he's managing. Is that true? Is it still a case of he has a protected status within the club, or is this the beginning of him becoming what we recognise as being a Chelsea manager in inverted commas?
I think the latter. It's quite telling that when Lampard was sort of making those phone calls to Timo Werner, to Kai Havertz, even to Hakim Ziyech back at the beginning of the year, to persuade those guys to join Chelsea, he was talking about a 3-year plan of progression towards becoming proper contenders. Now, I think that this is year one of that 3-year plan. I don't think last year was year zero. It was get through that, and look, they did well to finish in the top 4. I suppose you could argue that other teams fell away a bit, and Spurs' issues, etc. So there was an opportunity there which they took. But this is the start, as you say, of Lampard experiencing some of the pressures that his predecessors endured. He has to demonstrate progress. And I think now Champions League qualification is the bare minimum for him. That old policy that has really been in place throughout Abramovich's ownership, that applies now. You've got to finish in the top 4 and get Champions League football for next season to guarantee the revenue streams in a market that even Chelsea are, a couple of years' time they could be feeling the pinch still. So progression is competing more coherently in the Premier League, qualifying for the Champions League. You do that, and the team style is developing as well, which I think we are seeing evidence of now. Then Lampard remains very much in control of his own destiny. If any of those things fall by the wayside, then he will start to endure the same issues that his predecessors did.
I think this is where I have a little bit of a problem, because obviously being able to spend £200 million plus on new players in summer is a great luxury. Mm-hmm. With that, though, comes a little bit of a cultural challenge. Firstly, assimilating, almost half a new side into Premier League life, and creating the necessary partnerships to be successful straight off the hoof, and also during a pre-season which isn't normal. Kai Havertz arrived without a proper pre-season, for instance, but also having built the base of a side off players who've been nurtured and grown inside the club's academy, for the most part. You're challenging it by introducing an entirely different set of elements, which is big money signings, big egos potentially. That's not meant to be a criticism of anybody that's come in, but if you get bought for a lot of money, you are going to arrive with a little bit of a swagger. Isn't it? It just seems fairer to me that in this year one, there's an acceptance of the time lag, whereby we're investing in this, and for 6 months, maybe it's going to be a little bit disjointed. I mean, if he finishes 5th, 6th with a Liverpool who are still very good, a Manchester City who have spent a lot of money, Manchester United we're not sure of, Tottenham look a lot better than they were. It feels like, I understand the argument from a revenue streams perspective, but it doesn't feel like failure at the moment. Top 6 is it kind of almost a false negative under the circumstances, potentially.
I don't think he'd get away with it.
No.
No, I mean, no, not a chance. No way. It's £200 million, in a market where no one's spending any money. And they're not necessarily, you're right, they're not necessarily buying players that are at their peak. They're buying potential to a large extent. Mate, Ziyech is obviously slightly older. I think he's 27. And you could argue that he's hitting the peak of his form. Thiago Silva's very different in as much as...
Feels like a dressing room signing.
Absolutely, but a hell of a signing just for a short-term basis. I mean, if you get a year out of him playing at the level he is at the moment, then you're laughing. And it also, that buys you more time to find your long-term replacements at centre-half, and they might be younger players. But your Werners and your Havertz, your Chilwells, they're joining a dressing room where they're actually a similar age to a lot of the guys that have come through the academy. And I think that will probably make it easier for those guys to accept them within the fold and to assimilate them into the group. So I don't actually think there'll be that. I think if you're a young kid who's grown up at Chelsea's academy across the road, Cobham's training centre has a road that goes straight down the middle. One side is the academy, one side is the first team building. It's a rite of passage, that journey across from one to the other. is when you make it or when you're being binned. I mean, I remember Nicolas Anelka had to park his car. Florian Malouda had to park his car in the academy building because they're being excluded from the first team.
I remember the Sky Sports pictures of Florian Malouda juggling a football by himself in some far-flung corner.
And it's a massive site. You can lose yourself. I have lost myself in that site. I mean, the pictures that go back all the way up to the M25 pretty much. But it's that progression. Those guys who have been steeped in that education of football at Chelsea from the age of 8 or 9, they know that they're going to be facing huge competition for places in the first team picture. They know, they expect that. They've watched the club sign rafts of 26 to 30 year olds over the years, or maybe not 30, 26 to 29 year olds over the years, and they know that it's a job to hold down a position amongst that competition. So it's not a culture shock for them to see all these guys moving in. It just makes Chelsea more competitive. And given the congested nature of this season and the fact that you're going to have all these fixtures across all these competitions in a shorter amount of time, it's the best time possible to have what you could argue is a bloated squad where you've got competition in virtually every position in that team. Because players are going to be fatigued. Players are going to be mentally and physically fatigued. They're going to be risking injury. They're going to recognise that because the sports scientists at Chelsea are going to be stressing that to them. They will willingly sit out the odd game here and there, which will give others a chance to play and keep the whole group satisfied, I think. So actually, I think Chelsea have been quite shrewd on it. It's played into their hands. I mean, nobody foresaw the pandemic, but that transfer ban, which admittedly became one window, but they didn't spend for 2 windows, meant that they saved all this money up, not least from the sale of Hazard, from the sale of Morata, people like that. They had bucket loads of money to spend in the summer, and it won't really reflect that poorly on their accounts in the years ahead either. They've been shrewd in the way that they've approached it all, and it has, as we look at it now, it appears to be working in their favour.
Let's finish by being speculative, because it's always seemed like Roman Abramovich has had a special relationship with the core of players that delivered Chelsea's first title, and Lampard is obviously front and centre of that. How in play is that dynamic going forward? Because if there was a situation where there was a slump in form, there was a finish outside the top 4, there was a disaster season, a mid-table finish, I don't necessarily think that will happen, but is Lampard protected by any of this, or is he... How ruthless are Chelsea prepared to be in this situation? Because they are the club of hiring and firing managers. They are not necessarily as familiar with a situation of having to slay a club legend potentially, which is what this would be. It's very similar to the situation Manchester United have with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Obviously, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is in a slightly different position, and Frank Lampard is a much bigger part of Chelsea's history. But how does that change things going forward, if it does at all, with Abramovich and with Marina Granovskaya?
If it came to that, if it came to wielding the axe, I'm sure Chelsea would go back to the ruthlessness of old, because that's how they have to operate. An elite level club, a business that needs to be competing at a certain level. If they felt that was going to be jeopardised and the decisions being made by the head coach weren't working, then yeah, they would act ruthlessly. I'm sure they may change. They may insist that they have changed over the years, and to a certain extent, I guess you can argue that they have to a point. When things are threatened, when the progress of the club is threatened, they act, and it will be awkward if it comes to that with Frank Lampard, because he is an icon at Stamford Bridge still. So if they have to say goodbye to him, yeah, that will be a difficult moment for all concerned. But Chelsea deep down are still Chelsea, and Abramovich he may not be there, but he's still overseeing all this. He has standards. He knows what he expects of his team, the investment that he's put in, and he continues to put in, demands results. So if things stutter, and at the moment, it appears to be a progression. Everything that's been asked of Lampard, he's providing. But if things stutter, yes, I'm sure they will react. And they will be, to be honest, they'll be a better prospect for an elite coach if there was a job available there now compared to when Lampard took over, which, you'd like to think that Lampard would be given the chance to see this through, to turn this team and this club into what he wants them to be. And he's
to do all 3 of those years that he pitched to his
absolutely,
new players.
If there is this 3-year plan, and it's not over now. I mean, you look at the team, there's still deficiencies in that team. It's not the finished article. They still need a defensive midfielder. And there's a reason they're continually linked with Declan Rice. They still need a centre-half that's going to occupy the Thiago Silva role in the future. I mean, he's having a wonderful effect on those around him at the moment in Kurt Zouma and indeed the fullbacks. I mean, the development of Reece James, who's spoken glowingly of the impact that Thiago Silva's had on his career already. But he's a short-term stopgap. He's going to get a year, possibly 2 at the most, out of him. And so they need to replenish their stock of experienced leaders at centre-half. It's by no means the end of this journey. One summer splurge is not the end. It's the beginning, as Lampard says. This is year 1. Let's see where we are in year 2, in year 3, and what Chelsea look like then. And fingers crossed Lampard is given that chance to see things through. But if it's faltering, if it's stuttering, then we all know the way it goes.